Our next panel conversation will focus on the future of democracy and election security. We'll be joined virtually by Condoleezza Rice, director at the Hoover Institution and former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and Michael Froman, president of the Council on Foreign Relations and former U.S. Trade Representative. While on stage, we are welcoming Michael Chertoff, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security and co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group, and Sir Alex Younger, former chief of MI6. To moderate this conversation, we are joined by Ylber Bajraktari, Senior Policy Advisor for SCSP.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed so far 7+ hours of discussions. We have another 3 exciting hours to go, but I'm really thrilled to be welcoming this exceptional panel of distinguished public servants, Dr. Rice, Secretary Chertoff, Sir Alex, and Ambassador Froman, to discuss the state of world affairs, particularly the future of democracy and the democratic world. So next year, more than 2 billion people around the world, including in key democracies such as India, United States, Taiwan, members of the European Union, will be voting in elections. In many ways, this is a cause for celebration, as nearly a quarter of the world's population have an opportunity to go to the ballot box and elect their representatives, many of them not for the first time, obviously. But there's also tremendous cause for concern. We heard earlier from the president of the National Endowment for Democracy that we just marked the 18th year of democracy in retreat. So democracies are being challenged, some from within, some from without. Russia's aggression of Ukraine obviously is the most violent manifestation of these challenges that democracies are facing. Now, on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, China is stepping up its pressure on Taiwan as it gets ready for its general elections in January. And then elsewhere around the world, you have instances of leaders coming into the office through elections, but then turning autocratic once in office. And disinformation, a virus unleashed by Russia against the free world, remains a significant challenge and likely to get worse with recent advances in generative AI. So with that as a context, I would like to begin by asking each of our panelists if they are optimistic or pessimistic about the prospects for democracies next year, and what gives them reason to be hopeful or what gives them reasons to be concerned. And I would like to start with you, Dr. Rice, if you can start us first, and then we'll go to Ambassador Froman, and then we'll come here on stage with Sir Alex and Secretary Chertoff. Dr. Rice, please.
Well, thank you very much. I would begin by saying that I am optimistic. It doesn't mean I have rose-colored glasses about the challenges that democracy faces, but when I think about the long arc rather than just the last several years, I am reminded of how many countries have been given over to democracy. First of all, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, for instance, so that we can talk about democracy in Poland or democracy in the Czech Republic. And yes, Hungary is problematic, but in 1980, we didn't have those democracies in Eastern Europe. I taught a course on civil-military relations. I could always talk about a junta in Latin America in the 80s. We don't have that in Latin America. And so I think we have to have perspective. There are more and more countries where people are saying, I want to have basic rights to say what I think and worship as I please and be free from the knock of the secret police at night and choose those who are going to govern me. And that remains, I think, the deepest human aspiration. Now, there are challenges. There are challenges of technology. I think maybe the biggest challenge is making every citizen feel that they really have a chance in this fast advancing, technologically sophisticated, difficult economy. And so maybe one of the questions that democracies should ask themselves is, what can we do to really regenerate in our populations a feeling that democracy is really working for me? And that, I think, is an even bigger challenge to democracies than foreign interference in elections or the like.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. Ambassador Froman?
Well, I agree and would build on Condi's optimism about democracies. I think with all of our problems, we're still the prettiest house on an ugly block, so to speak, in that I'd much rather have our problems than the problems of the autocracies. And just to look over the last couple of years, whether it was the decisions in Russia or the decisions in China that were hampered by the lack of a feedback loop, the lack of democracy, the lack of public participation, that led both countries down a very bad and dangerous path. And on the other side, again, we look at the democracies and look around the regions of the world. In Europe, again, in response to what's going on with the Russian attack on Ukraine, we've got more coherence, more action by democracies, collective action, even over very difficult issues, whether it's how to manage an energy crisis or mobilizing spending for defense. In the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, between the Quad and AUKUS and the tripartite cooperation now between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, I think we've seen really dramatic action of democracies coming together, overcoming differences, and having an effective collective action. And I think that bodes well for the future of democracy.
Great, thank you. Sir Alex?
Well, on one level, I'm a child of the Enlightenment. I'm thoroughly convinced that democracy is the best way of organizing yourself, both in terms of its moral legitimacy, but also its resilience. However, I'm also a spy, and habitually we're not paid to be optimistic. And in this case, that's also true, but I think possibly for reasons that might surprise you, because I don't think disinformation is the biggest issue, even if it's probably what I'm here to talk about. The biggest issue is this, and if you take the US as an example, I speak as a respectful foreigner and an ardent Atlanticist. People are losing confidence in the system, and trust in government is falling. And I find that entirely unsurprising. 1% of the US own 50% of the wealth. For all of the talk today, I think what I've heard is that key technologies like generative AI will present as a replacement for work, at least in the short term, in ways that will be destabilizing of identity. Social media is optimized to polarize. Key things that make the nation state work, monopolies of violence and money, are being undermined. And tech corporations are bigger than governments and yet not accountable. So you wonder why our electorates are divided. I think that list gives you a pretty good example. So the biggest threat, I think, is that we blame it all on the Russians and the Chinese. By contrast, and this is the good news, actually, I think a lot of our problems belong to us and are ours to solve when we have agency. And by the way, I'm not here to give you the list of all the problems that beset autocracy. I hope we take those as read. Now, finally, when it comes, though, to disinformation, spiel apart, it is a savagely difficult problem, and it's going to get more and more dangerous, particularly as it lands on this very fertile and divided and polarized field that I have discussed. And the key issue about disinformation is that the West has an asymmetric vulnerability. Our system needs the truth to operate. The truth is the enemy to authoritarian regimes. So to the extent that these technologies offer the opportunity to degrade the truth, they're a net advantage to autocrats. And that is a big problem. I'm sure we'll talk later about how we organize to deal with it, but it's a thing that certainly worries me.
Thank you, Sir Alex. And Secretary Chertoff.
Well, I don't want to repeat what's been said, much of which I agree with, but I would say there's one additional cause for optimism and one cause for pessimism. On the optimism side, we have seen people in countries all over the world at some personal risk going into the street to demonstrate against what they see as authoritarian moves or undermining of the rule of law or things that impinge upon freedom. And that shows that the average person can be motivated to basically pick themselves up and go out there and fight for freedom. On the pessimistic side, one of the things, and here artificial intelligence actually has been problematic, is that political actors who are simply devoting themselves to getting reelected increasingly are looking to rig the rules of the game so that they can control the outcome. Because as we know, if you watch a football match, if you own the referees and you write the rule book, you win every football match. And so what we see in this country, for example, is people writing rules about eligibility for election, when you can vote, who can vote, whether there are impediments to voting, and also dealing with the question of counting in such a way as to undermine the ability of people to express their will and to have confidence in the result. And so I think looking at the rule set that governs the way we vote is critically important if we are to maintain people's confidence in voting. Otherwise, they'll simply say, what's the point? The outcome is foreordained. And that would be a very dangerous undermining of our belief in our Constitution and in our democratic values.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Chertoff. So, Alex, if I could go back to you, you rightly spotlighted sort of the internal challenges to democracies, but as you noted also, you were an intelligence officer for nearly 30 years, including serving as one of the longest serving heads of MI6, a premier intelligence agency, obviously. So I was wondering, you watched Russia and China closely over many years. Can you speak about their efforts to subvert democracies and democratic processes in particular, and what should we be watching out for next year?
So I think the question is, why do they do this? And let's take this as a compliment. They regard functioning democracy as a threat, which kind of gives us a clue as to how we should proceed. But they're also subtly different. So I spent a lot of my later career watching disinformation attacks coming in from Russia, which is quite a sort of centralized approach to this stuff. And I couldn't work it out. They seem to be on the right, on the left, on the correct, on the not correct. It was random. And I thought, what is their strategic objective here? Until I realized that their strategic objective is simply to muddy the waters, to make trusting the government more difficult. And why do they want to do that? Well, apart from the intrinsic desirability of weakening our systems, it's about creating equivalence. They want to create an idea in our mind that our government's just as bad as the Russian government. They've given up trying to make anyone think the Russian government's good. It's about giving this cynical resignation that we're all the same. And that in turn feeds Putin's worldview, which is might is right, and we might as well just divide things up between us. So that's what's going on with Russia. It's the context in which we need to look at it, and I think we can only expect it to scale up. China is interesting. It's different, and in some ways it's also a betrayal of the insecurity of the Communist Party and Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has really no tolerance at all now for any successful example of an alternative mode of government in his near abroad or his periphery. So we were horrified, particularly as Brits, by what he did in Hong Kong, where he reneged on the agreement. I take it as a sign of weakness. So democracy surfaces as a threat. And a lot of disinformation there is about closing down any potential alternative, trying to delegitimize this stuff. Now, it's quite parochial. A lot of it is about dealing with so-called the five poisons, the dissidents that might threaten China, but it's widening and it's becoming more pernicious. And there's now a greater emphasis on conditioning how you think about some of the key issues that matter to Xi Jinping. And perhaps that's the biggest issue, because the technologies and capabilities available in China are much greater. But bizarrely, China actually uses a very capitalistic approach to its cyber attack. It's broadly dispersed and highly entrepreneurial.
Thank you, Sir Alex. Secretary Chertoff, if I could pick up on where Sir Alex left off. So Taiwan has elections in January. We just heard from the Minister of Digital Affairs from Taiwan. Obviously, we have elections here in the US in November of next year. What worries you the most as you look at these two elections? And what do you think should be the most important considerations for the government, for technological companies, and for the voters, really?
Well, I'm concerned about, first of all, the lack of trust we have, at least in our population. I can't speak for Taiwan. Lack of trust in government and in institutions, and even in facts and in science. So that really, talking about the sun rising in the east, you start to get people saying it's a conspiracy. So the Russians have some fertile ground to work in, and they are going to be, I think, very motivated to invest as much as they can in trying to get the candidate they want to win the election. Because I think their view is that if their favorite candidate wins, Ukraine will wind up losing a good deal of American support, if not all of it, And that is a much more powerful weapon than Putin's been able to mobilize in his ground operations so far. So I think this is going to be, in many respects, an existential election for Ukraine and a very, very important election for us. So what should people do about it? What should Americans do about it? Well, I mean, one of the challenges we have is if the government gives warning about misinformation, that tends to get a negative reaction from some people. We even had a judge in the U.S., a federal judge the other day, rule that for the government to contact social media platforms and tell them they've got wrong information on the platform, even without threatening them or having the ability to punish them, that's illegal censorship under the First Amendment. I don't agree with that, but what it maybe is emblematic of is the fact that increasingly people at the political ends of the spectrum view any government effort to correct the record as inherently somehow illegitimate and a violation of the First Amendment. That means the private sector is going to have to play a more responsible role in making sure that they police themselves to eliminate clearly false messages, deep fakes, messages that originate out of foreign countries but are masquerading as Americans. And in order to make sure that the platforms do it, the public is going to have to make it clear to the advertisers and the sponsors that it's important to them that the platforms police themselves because money talks. And in many cases, the platforms respond to that. So I think this is going to require a very, very substantial private effort to make sure that we are upholding the integrity and the honesty and the trust which people have a right to rely upon.
Thank you. Dr. Rice, if maybe if we could take a step back from the elections. You're one of our nation's foremost experts on Russia. When you look at the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, how essential do you think the outcome of that war is to the future of democracy around the world, but including in Russia?
I think that it is essential. It's essential because what Vladimir Putin has done is to decide that he wants to have a 19th century view of empire, that it's the Russian Empire that needs to be recreated, and you can't have an independent Ukraine and a Russian Empire, as Zbigniew Brzezinski so wisely said. And so if he succeeds at that, if he succeeds at you can extinguish your smaller neighbor to reestablish empire, this is not a world in which I think any of us will want to live, because there will be others who decide to move in the same direction. And so, yes, it's critical. I would say that Vladimir Putin has already lost a lot. 1 million Russians have left. This is an economy that will start to show the strains of having been isolated in this way. Russian energy production will never look again like it once did, because those difficult fields in Sakhalin or the old fields that they are trying to resuscitate, they need Western technology to do that. That is now denied to them. So Vladimir Putin is destroying his country, and we have to continue to make that point. And one thing that Yevgeny Prigozhin did before his untimely end was to say to the Russian people that this was an unnecessary war. Unfortunately, I don't think Vladimir Putin can now contain the sense of many Russians that indeed this was a ruinous and unnecessary war. But if I may just on elections for one moment, it is absolutely true that Americans in particular are losing confidence in their institutions. It is absolutely true that only 35% of Americans say that they have confidence in their elections. But you know, an interesting thing, they're still voting. And they're voting in ever larger numbers. And I think sometimes we look at the extremes and we forget that the large swath of the American population goes about their daily business. They organize themselves in what de Tocqueville called voluntary associations. We would know them today as American Red Cross and Rotary Clubs. American democracy is not just Washington. Thank goodness for that. And so I really do think that when we think about democracy, we have to think about it as something that is layered. Now, I think that one reason that we're having trouble with the question of what is the truth and disinformation and science is that the response of the government to COVID really hurt on this. People were told one thing, then they were told another. They were told to follow the science, but then the science kept changing. And so it's maybe not surprising that if we're not careful, we can stretch the definition of what is truth to a matter of simply policy differences. And so I'm awfully careful when I talk about what is true, because very often we're talking about something that will evolve or that can be disputed.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. Sir Alex, Dr. Rice argued that the war in Ukraine is essential to the future of democracy. You think that view is shared in Europe? We see some signs of potential weakening of the resolve in Europe in terms of seeing the outcome of the war, a favorable outcome of the war in Ukraine through.
Well, I mean, I'm a European, and that's what I think, but it may regrettably not be representative. I have found when I talk about these issues in Europe, as I do a lot, characterizing it as an ideological battle between autocracy and democracy, even if that's very much as I see it, doesn't cut through in the way that it might. And I think we as securocrats, if I can call us that, should take some responsibility. There have been some pretty quixotic adventures over the last 15 years that have degraded people's willingness to listen when we talk about something being an ideological battle. You can explain it, though, another way, in a much more practical way, which is fundamentally, and it was done very well this morning, that to show weakness is escalatory, that Vladimir Putin is not going to stop here, that there's an obvious read across to other parts of the world like China. And actually, Europe, while it's still an active debate, has performed in a much more coherent and robust and energetic way than I would have expected. It's been a big upside surprise to me, and I think a downside surprise to Vladimir Putin. Of course, recognizing the phenomenally important role the United States has played, and the skillful role, by the way, in galvanizing this alliance.
Great. Thank you, Sir Alex. Ambassador Froman, if I can go to you next, an issue that you have worked for a long time in the government, a matter of international economics. So there's been a lot of discussion about democratic backsliding recently, but there's also a considerable backlash against globalization, one would argue, an increased focus on national industrial strategies. So how concerned are you about these trends, or how concerned should we be about these trends? And what are the dangers that you see to democracies from this increased economic nationalism?
Well, I think there are two things happening, really. One is a retreat from what might be called hyper-globalization, where all the focus was on efficiency and the supply chains were designed around that. And now we see, not just because of COVID, but it's been accelerated by that, a trend towards looking at supply chains through the perspective of security, resilience, redundancy, reliability. And that's going to lead companies to, whether it's reshore or friendshore, nearshore, or just diversify. It's good risk management to diversify your supply chain. You're not overly reliant on one country for all your production. That is in the process of happening. I think what's interesting about that is it is inherently going to be more expensive, right? Almost by definition, that if you're not seeking efficiency as the only goal, but these other goals, which are totally legitimate to pursue, is a more inflationary or a higher cost framework for production. And that ought to be part of our democratic debate, because we don't like reliance on China and we don't like inflation. And part of our democratic debate ought to be, okay, what's the balance we're going to strike in order to achieve the security, resilience, and redundancy that we value as well? I think the second part of it is there's been a convergence of, let's call it, geopolitics and geoeconomics. And so increasingly, economics is looked at through a geopolitical and a security lens, and hence the focus on ensuring that we have sufficient domestic production or sufficient allied production in critical technologies, whether that's advanced chips, or materials or critical minerals and the like. It's going to take a long time to build that up. You are all more expert in this than I am, but I think it's an important evolution in how we've thought about international economic policy. We can do it together with other countries, in which case I think we'll be able to achieve a great deal. If it relies solely on national policies, I think we may find ourselves having more fights with our allies than we need to. And I think it's incumbent on us to figure out how to achieve that security with our secure allies as well.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Froman. Dr. Rice, if I could follow up on some of the issues that Ambassador Froman mentioned, particularly the issue of geopolitics and economics. In a recent piece in The Economist with Neil Ferguson, you highlighted 5 lessons from the Cold War that you think could be useful in framing the way we approach our competition with China. And I think the 5 were the importance of allies, the necessity of strong military capabilities, the prudence of efforts to avoid accidental war, the criticality of pointing out weaknesses of our competitors, and then finally that nothing is inevitable. My question is, do you think America's current approach to China reflects these 5 lessons? Where do you think there's more room for improvement? And then finally, in line with the topic of our panel, how prominently do you think our advocacy for democracy should feature in our strategy?
Well, let me start with the last point, which is that I think the United States will always advocate for democracy and should always advocate for democracy. It doesn't mean that you won't deal with countries that are not democratic. Sometimes there's a sense that if you have to deal with a strategic partner and they are not democratic, that you're somehow turning your back on democracy. America isn't an NGO. And so we will sometimes have to deal with countries that are unlike us. And so I still think, though, to be voice for the voiceless is critical. I think America is a place that people still look to as a beacon of freedom. It's why so many desperate people want to come to the United States. And when it comes to the Cold War, of course, we were a voice for the voiceless during the Cold War. And it actually eventually worked out that some of those voiceless people became our best allies. So maybe we should keep that in mind as a sort of long stretch of how we deal with adversaries. I think we're doing relatively well on many of those points. For instance, I think on allies, if I look at the American alliances and friends in the Indo-Pacific, they're pretty impressive. Australia and India as a friend, and Vietnam and the Philippines looking to get closer, and Japan emerging as a larger voice in strategic stability in the region. And so South Korea. The United States has real allies. I think China has a lot of clients, but we should be we should recognize the value of those allies. I worry that we may not be fully attentive to the need for our military capabilities. Not only is China increasing its capabilities, but it is increasing it in areas that may look like they are denial to our ability to function in the Indo-Pacific. And so we need to pay attention to that. And this is one place where the private sector, so much technology that is coming out of the private sector now can't get into the Pentagon because the Pentagon has archaic, slow processes of procurement that keep the best technology from getting to our forces. And so we need to fix that. The one place that I am mostly concerned is this question of accidental war. I was the national security advisor in April of 2001 when the Chinese pilot, just hot dogging in international airspace, knocked our reconnaissance plane down. They kept our crew for 7 days. For 3 days, we couldn't get them to take our phone call. We have exquisite deconfliction measures with the Russians coming out of the Soviet period where we didn't want to have an accidental nuclear war. Many of them still work. We have nothing like that with China, and I think that's a high priority so that we don't have an accidental hot conflict. Chinese ships are getting way too close to American ships. Chinese aircraft are being more and more aggressive. This is an accident waiting to happen, and I hope people are saying that in a more fulsome way to Beijing.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. And Sir Alex, how would you grade the current approach towards China? If you were to use the same 5 sort of lessons from the Cold War or any other yardstick?
Yeah, this is topical. There's a lot of focus on Chinese spying in the UK at the moment, and I won't comment on the detail of that, but it's led to a lot of panic, understandably, given the conversation we've just been having. And my view on this is you've got to be able to talk and chew gum at the same time. I think when it comes to something like China, which is a big fact, as Dr. Rice has explained, we can't just ignore its existence. We need to do three things. We need to confront it when it presents a direct threat to our security, including in the disinformation space. Then we need to compete with it. And if you ask me what is the arbiter of whether our democracies will ultimately prevail and be in rude health in 30 years' time, is whether we, as a free value system, command the heights of emerging technology, as indeed China aspires to do. And if you ask me why I'm here and why I think the SCSP is a laudable organization, it's because they recognize the gravity of that. So let's compete like hell. But the final C is cooperate. This is one planet. There are significant issues that cannot be solved without some form of global agreement. And as Dr. Rice has said, I share her deep anxiety about the total absence of channels for communication. And if I got one thing out of the balloon episode, obviously I'm not an insider, but it seemed to me that there was a real paucity of options when it came for either side to communicate with each other. And those need to be built up. So there has got to be some nuance, even as we remain absolutely determined with all of our strength, particularly in the sort of covert world, to deal with assaults on the integrity of our societies. The political leadership problem, I think, is to explain that we've got to do these three things, and that you're not either kind of some massive securocrat or some kind of appeaser. We've got to be able to play the whole spectrum. That's what they do to us.
Thank you, Sir Alex. Ambassador Froman, using Sir Alex's the three C's, the confront, compete, and cooperate, but focusing on the compete aspect of it. One criticism you hear nowadays internationally is that U.S.'s inability to pursue or forge new trade agreements really hinders its ability to either pursue new strategic partnerships or relationships, or really contest China in some of these key strategic terrains. So how can the U.S. and other democracies really maintain their appeal if trade is not part of their toolbox when they're competing with China?
Well, first of all, I think it's a bit overstated to say that sort of trade policy is not being pursued more broadly. The UK just joined the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. The EU has a pretty robust trade agenda. In Africa, they're implementing now a continental-wide free trade agreement. So other countries are continuing to move ahead and sign trade agreements and integrate themselves. In the U.S., I think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the Biden administration is pursuing, there's a political recognition that tariff reductions are not politically viable right now. But in the absence of that, there's a recognition that engagement with the countries in the region around the issues, a number of them are critically important issues to the economy, including rules around the digital economy, in some ways perhaps even more important than tariff reduction, because we're already a very open economy. I think we can make a lot of progress in bringing countries, like-minded countries together around the issues of the future of the economy, around technology, around supply chains, around the digital economy, and perhaps not have the debate over, well, is this an FTA, a free trade agreement or not? Are we doing market access or not? Are we having tariffs or not? There's still a lot we can do in economic cooperation with U.S. leadership and U.S. engagement around the world. And I think we're well on our way towards doing that. And we continue to have to ramp that up and do more.
Thank you, Ambassador Froman. We have 5 minutes left, so would like to sort of conclude with a question on the nexus of technology and democracy, and the importance of technology, to the pursuit of democracy and defense of democracies. So to start with you, Secretary Chertoff, when you were back the Secretary of Homeland Security, obviously cyber threats, I think, were relatively a new phenomenon. You had to contend with that. Now we have generative AI coming online. How should we be approaching that? How should the U.S. government be thinking about generative AI, and what challenges it presents, if you will, to the democratic processes, particularly here domestically?
Well, I think generative AI, I don't think it's a threat. I think it may enhance threats, but it also may enhance defenses. It's like any other tool. For the most part, it can be used different ways by different people. I would say, broadly speaking, what I'm most concerned about with generative AI as it relates to our security is the use of it to commit frauds, a bias that's implicit in it that winds up hurting people in terms of their ability to get hired or get certain benefits or be admitted into certain privileges, invasions of privacy, and of course, even the ability to have a much more detailed and precise reconnaissance of where our assets are, which has a military application and also a private sector application. Broadly speaking, I think there are two things government needs to do. One is we do need, with respect to domestic creators of AI, to have guardrails that put certain restrictions and certain mandates on what they produce and sell. I break them into 3 Ds. There should be a requirement that if you use AI, you assure that the data, the first D is data, that's relied upon is accurate, unbiased, and not an invasion of privacy. The second D is disclosure. If you're using AI to generate a message or a video or an audio, you ought to say generated in whole or in part by AI so people are forewarned. And finally, decision making. If you're using AI to make a decision about someone's privileges or future, whether they can be admitted into the country, whether they can receive certain benefits, a human being needs to be in the decisional loop. I would not let the machine make it. So that's what I think government has to do in a regulatory sense. But I also think government needs to induce and work with the private sector to build AI into an effective defense against some of the more dangerous uses that it might be applied to by our adversaries. That means to build AI that is capable of warning people when they're being phished online and being fooled into trying to click on something that's going to wind up infecting them. Putting rules into effect and putting capabilities into effect that do not allow voices to be imitated in a way that would undermine multi-factor authentication, which is now one of the major tools we're increasingly using in cyberspace. Again, having tools that can identify deep fakes, videos, so that we can label them, even if the person who generates it won't do it, label it as fake and AI generated. And finally, using AI to detect biases that may have been induced by AI. So I think we can make AI into a helper in defending ourselves, but the government has to induce and encourage and cooperate with the private sector in doing that.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Chertoff. Dr. Rice, how do you think about the sort of the nexus of emerging technologies and democracy? Where can they help and where they present risks and dangers?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to recognize that human beings have always been a little bit better at the knowledge part of technology than the wisdom part of technology. And with these powerful technologies, we're going to have to be wise. And I won't concentrate on the threats. I think Mike has done a very good job of talking about some of the threats. I think we all know that there are threats if authoritarian regimes use these technologies in particular ways because of the nature of those regimes. But let me just make a point about what is possible on the good side for democracy. And that is that I think democracies have trouble on the delivery issue these days. Simply delivering for all of our citizens the best healthcare, the best education. And I actually think that is contributing to the problem that you raised with Mike Froman, which is this sense that globalization didn't work for so many people because people without skills, people who got left behind, people who are opioid addicted and wonder why are we spending all this money in Ukraine. And so I would like to see AI in the service of a better delivery of education and healthcare for every person and every child. Because ultimately, as much as we want to judge democracy on its great values and its great principles, it does have to deliver for its people. Because when people elect their governments, they expect a lot of them. And I think AI can help in the delivery of those very important life-sustaining elements.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rice. Ambassador Froman?
Look, I would just foot stomp what Dr. Rice just said. I think that's absolutely right. And I think we should be looking at, well, we have to work about on the guardrails, protections around the new technology, which are going to be difficult, and particularly at the international context, around governance issues. I think we should be looking optimistically at what the potential contribution is for helping democracies deliver for their people. Because ultimately, I think building a consensus in the United States, in other democracies, that the system is working and that people feel included and feel empowered, that's what the service of those technologies should be about. And we should make sure we're directing towards those objectives.
Great. Thank you. Sir Alex?
Well, look, slight change of tone. I took the liberty of asking a Chinese contact of mine this question: who's going to win the innovation race? And their answer was candid, if a bit self-serving. They said, we, China, will win anything where the rewards go to centralization. And you, the West, will win anything where the rewards go to decentralization. Now, the reason it was a self-serving comment is because I think at that point he felt that AI would basically work for their system, not ours. But I observed that it's going in a very different direction. Putin has hit bone when he invaded Ukraine. He's been brought up short. Why? Because a centralized regime has proved inferior to a decentralized regime. A lot of the power and innovation I've heard about this morning is a response to a decentralized regime that trusts people and empowers them and unleashes innovation. So a bit of this for me is about confidence and recognizing that we've got the innate strength to do this if we hold on to that confidence.
Great. Thank you very much, Sir Alex, Secretary Chertoff, Dr. Rice, Ambassador Froman. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated the insights, and thank you for being with us today.